What do you think when you hear the word bias? Lots of people think of it as a negative word, but biases are part of who we are as human beings and exist in large part to protect us. These biases have the potential to influence our everyday decisions, actions, and interactions, both at home and at work. So, understanding our own biases is vitally important in creating the best interactions between us and the people we serve. My name is Bernie Lopez. I'm the Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion for Thomas Jefferson University. Come on a short journey with me to learn about something called unconscious bias. In this introductory learning experience, Dr. Emile Bruno, a cognitive neuroscientist from the Peace and Conflict Lab at the University of Pennsylvania, will teach us what unconscious bias is, how it works in our daily lives, and how understanding it can help us improve our daily interactions.
Most people think our brain's job is to give us the most accurate, high-fidelity readout of the world possible. A pepper is a pepper, a backpack is a backpack, a mop is a mop. We want to believe that we see things exactly as they are. But a neuroscientist would say, that's exactly wrong. The brain is actually riddled with a whole set of prior assumptions and biases that have been baked in through evolution. Take the visual system. Let's say we see this image. Our brains very quickly recognize it's a backpack. We process this instantly and unconsciously. But at the same time, we also see a face. Our brain processes the face just as quickly, automatically, and unconsciously as it did the backpack. This is an optical illusion generated by our unconscious brains that demonstrates a bias in the visual system. Our brains are so primed to see faces that we often see them where they don't exist. Here's another optical illusion. This is a two-dimensional image, but why does it look 3D, like one of the dots is coming out at you? Look what happens when we do this. Now, all but one looks like it's coming out at you. So it's not the image that's doing this work, it's our brains. This reveals a prior bias. Our brains see the circles that are light on top and dark on the bottom as bumps. This is because our brains assume that the light source will come from above. So why would we assume that? Because, you guessed it, the sun. This assumption is ingrained in all of us. Just like seeing faces and objects, our brains are constantly creating this illusion all day, every day. Now let's look at this rectangle. It may look like all one color, but it's slightly lighter on the right side. Look what happens when we do this. Now our brains trick us into thinking the contrast is stark, even though in reality it's very slight. Our ability to see contrast is what helps us see objects discreetly and to distinguish objects from their background. Seeing contrast like this is actually a key to our survival, as you will soon see. So it's a good thing our brains are doing this unconsciously every waking moment of our lives. And we don't even have to work hard to see these optical illusions. This all happens in a snap. In fact, some of these biases are how we prove that we are human on those online forums. It's very difficult for an unbiased computer to read the CAPTCHA text, but it's easy for us. This illustrates something very important about the brain that's captured by an analogy. The brain is like a rider sitting on top of an elephant, where the rider represents the small part of our brain that we're consciously aware of, and the elephant represents the vast majority of the processing that goes on in our brains, but that we're completely unaware of. The elephant applies these biased filters to incoming information, so data can be processed very quickly. As a result, our brains see things that are not there. They don't see things that are there, and they ignore some features and accentuate others, all without our awareness, endorsement, or permission. And yet, the question remains, why? Why does our visual system have these particular biases? It's simple. Brains that see this immediately as a lion are not eaten. Brains that don't see this as a lion or process it too slowly become dinner. We all have ancestors whose brains had to pass this test, and we all must understand that these biases will affect every human interaction we ever have, so it's important we learn more about them.
I'm going to talk to you today about what neuroscience knows about the biological basis of bias. My hope is to leave you with some understanding about what unconscious biases are, why they exist, and what we can do to reduce them. The human brain has this crazy monumental task. It has to make sense of tens of millions of bits of information that hit it every second. Our brain deals with this in a couple ways. First, it processes most of the information behind the scenes and below our conscious awareness. And second, it ignores or completely distorts much of the information coming in to fit prior assumptions. If we think of the brain like a rider sitting on an elephant, the rider represents the small part of your brain's processing about which you're consciously aware, while the elephant represents the vast majority of processing happening in your brain that you're completely unaware of. It's the unconscious brain, the elephant, that a number of the assumptions reside in. Some of the assumptions are built in, others we learn over time. Since we're generally unaware of these assumptions, we refer to them collectively as unconscious biases. In the visual system, we can identify these unconscious biases through optical illusions. Our brain exaggerates some visual features in the world and completely ignores others. It does this effortlessly and without our permission or awareness, making us see things not as they are, but how they're most useful to us. But unconscious biases are not limited only to the visual system. They're also present when processing information about the people around us, our social worlds. These biases can be revealed through what we might call social illusions. One of the most fundamental social illusions is the tendency to think not just in terms of me and you, but in terms of us and them, sometimes called tribalism. This tendency towards tribalism is so strong that when children or adults are randomly assigned to totally meaningless groups, for example, if half the people in a room are given red shirts and the other half are given blue shirts to wear, they start to favor their own group members. If they're in a red shirt, they tend to think of other red shirters as more attractive, intelligent, more trustworthy. And they give more resources to red shirters than they do to blue shirters. Again, even if they know the group distinctions are completely arbitrary. And once a tribal distinction has been drawn in the mind, other biases start coming online. One of these biases is called the fundamental attribution error. When someone misbehaves, we look for a reason why. The fundamental attribution error describes the tendency to blame anything bad I do to the situation. I was speeding because I have an important meeting to get to. While we tend to blame anything bad other people do to their disposition. They were speeding because they're a maniac. This tendency extends to other groups. For example, if a politician from our political tribe is caught lying, we tend to explain it away. They were just mistaken. Whereas when a politician from the other political tribe is caught lying, we see it as a window into their soul. They are a liar. This is not to say that either view is wrong, just that our brains nudge us to interpret every ambiguous interaction in this way. Another important social illusion is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out information from sources that will confirm what we already believe to be true, and to accept that information totally uncritically. Consider this headline: "Death penalty prevents crime." If you're against the death penalty, you're more likely to scrutinize this article for any inconsistencies and dismiss it entirely if you find anything dubious. This is confirmation bias. One study demonstrated confirmation bias by taking people who were for the death penalty and people who were against the death penalty and presenting all of them with the same strong, well-supported research that showed that the death penalty did in fact prevent crime, that it worked. They also gave the people critical reviews of that research. What they found is that people who were for the death penalty selectively paid attention to the research and discounted the critiques. And people who were against the death penalty paid attention only to the critiques and discounted the research. As a result, both sides were more extreme in their original views. In other words, our brains are built with an unconscious tendency to hear what we want to hear and disregard the rest. As with optical illusions, these social illusions and many others are automatic and baked into our unconscious brains. It's like your brain has different filters that it applies automatically to incoming information based on the source. When your brain's attention is on us, it automatically applies the enhanced filter, which makes you see in-group members as slightly more kind and virtuous and well-intentioned than they actually are. When you perceive them, your brain applies a different filter, which makes you see outgroup members as a little bit nastier, more wicked and ill-intentioned than they actually are. And the filters don't have to be wildly different to make a huge impact over time. If you think about it, if every image your mind takes your entire life paints us a bit more noble than we are in reality, and them as a bit more vile, you begin thinking that this is the way we and they really are. As with our visual system, these social illusions were shaped through evolution long, long ago. For hundreds of thousands of years, our human ancestors formed small tribes that fought fiercely with each other. 15% of every generation died from warfare for hundreds of thousands of years. Dividing the world into us and them helped our brains at that time navigate and survive the cutthroat world. But the diverse cooperative communities we find ourselves in now are very different from those which our ancestors' brains were shaped. In many ways, our unconscious brains have just not yet caught up. As a result, we now find ourselves trying to solve 21st century problems with Stone Age psychology. So this all paints a totally disheartening picture. If we're born with these biases, and they're beyond our conscious awareness, what on earth can we do about them? Well, fortunately, tribalism is not our only evolutionary legacy. We've also inherited the ability to exert an incredible amount of control over our unconscious brains. There are 100 trillion connections between nerve cells in our brains. And these connections are not only able to change, they're fundamentally designed to do so. Our brains are not static. They're not hardwired. They're plastic and elastic and always able to change. But how? How can we direct these changes? How can we be less reliant on or even transcend these social illusions? Well, psychologists and neuroscientists have identified some promising approaches. For one, it turns out that for some biases, even just becoming aware of them can enable us to pull them into conscious awareness and then reshape or reject them. Some biases we can dispel once we learn about them, like this. Others may require a bit more effort and time. But what's been learned through repetition can also be unlearned the same way. For example, when white participants were asked to practice thinking in terms of individuals rather than groups, or if they simulated in a simple video game repeatedly approaching black characters, their prejudice towards black people in general was reduced. Attribution errors can also be corrected with practice. In an experiment, white participants were given negative scenarios about black people and asked to select a reason for each behavior that was situational rather than attributional. For example, if they were told that a person was late for an interview and given the following options, either they're lazy or their power went out and their alarm reset, they were asked to choose the situational explanation each time, in this case that the power went out. They then repeated this exercise a number of times with different scenarios. The researchers found that just a few minutes of this attributional practice again improved attitudes towards black people in general. These effects were observed in these really simple little exercises. So imagine what could happen if we make the conscious choice to change our habits of thought. What if every day we reminded ourselves of our unconscious biases and gave ourselves little drills to retrain our brains? Changing habits takes effort at first, but as with learning to shoot a basketball, learning a new dance move, or learning to knit, it becomes easier and easier over time. With enough practice, we can make unwinding these social illusions just as automatic and unconscious as they are right now. We asked you at the beginning, what are unconscious biases? Why do we have them, and how can they be reduced? Hopefully you have a few answers to these questions now. We know that our brains lead us to tribalism and to apply different standards to our own group versus other groups. As a result, we're awash in hypocrisies and inconsistencies. We condemn members of other groups for the same exact actions we forgive coming from our own. A biased brain, though, is not abnormal or pathological. It's just a consequence of being human. This should give us some humility. But just because we're born with bias, we're not off the hook, because our brains are also incredibly flexible. They're not only able to change, but they're fundamentally built to do so. So there are a few common responses to learning about your own unconscious biases. We may feel ashamed that we harbor views that we don't condone, or we may feel resigned to biases that are baked into our brains. I want to offer an alternate response. Be fascinated with your biases. Be enthralled. Be excited when one of them is revealed to you. Because once you've learned to recognize them, then you can work at dismantling them. But if we fear what is in our minds, or feel ashamed and uncomfortable when it emerges, we have less opportunity to change. Remember, a biased brain is not abnormal or pathological. It's a consequence of being human. But while unconscious brains may be pre-wired with bias, nothing is hardwired. We have the potential to intentionally shape our unconscious mind and also the ability to gain conscious control over its processes. In fact, now that we know a bit about how our brains work, it may be our duty to change them. In the words of a wise scientist, those who have the privilege to know may have the duty to act.
We all have biases ingrained in us, whether it's seeing faces where they don't exist, seeing the world with an us versus them mentality, or seeking out information that confirms our biases. These biases in our visual system and social cognition are all part of what makes us human. Sure, they can do some good, like help us survive, but they also do us a disservice. Our brains filter information unconsciously and can exaggerate the differences between us and make us assume the worst about people that are different from us. Neuroscientists are right. We don't see things exactly as they are. We see things as we are. But here's the good news. Even though the elephant, our unconscious, takes in information through these bias filters, once the writer knows about them, we can learn to make conscious decisions to transcend and overcome these biases.